Hello everyone, I'm a racing driver with a passion for sim racing games which I've been playing for over 20 years. Since Assetto Corsa EVO version 0.4 was released, everyone on the internet has been showering it with praise, and I wanted to evaluate it myself to understand if anything had improved since my initial review of the game back when it was released. I own and run a radical SR3, which is a very capable racing car running on fat slick tyres and produces proper downforce. And I know exactly what it feels like to drive it at its limits and occasionally go beyond. This review will focus purely on the racing cars. I will do a separate video on the road cars at a later date, and after having done hundreds of laps in the Porsche Cup car, the GT3 BMW and the F2004, I wanted to share my findings in what will be a highly analytical, in-depth review. My conclusion is there are some fundamental problems with both the force feedback and the physics which simply don't allow anyone to drive the race cars in a completely natural way. And I'm going to explain why in detail. So let's begin. To analyse the quality of the force feedback and how well it's communicating the car balance, I have broken it down into three fundamental components: the car dynamics on turn-in, mid-corner and corner exit. In reality, all of this happens rather quickly and each component isn't truly distinct, but analysing the information in this way allows me to articulate in detail what is really going on with the force feedback and the physics. At corner entry, there are generally two key inputs: hitting the brakes hard and trail braking into the corner to induce that rotation, and of course the initial steering input. When I transfer weight to the front axle, the car balance tends to oversteer because I've unloaded the rear. If running a proper setup for quick lap times, this will always be the general behaviour of the car. Assetto Corsa EVO's force feedback does two things. There is a noticeable step change increase in the force and therefore resistance as I push against the wheel on turning, so I at least know the front is loaded. And secondly, there is a strong self-aligning force pulling the wheel the opposite way if the rear is starting to slide. That initial step change increase in the force feedback isn't particularly useful other than providing some resistance to push against on turning. The problem here is there is virtually no dynamic change in the force resistance as I turn in, so I really don't have any real idea of how much front grip I actually have. However, in this phase of the corner, that isn't actually that important because there's a self-aligning force giving me a really clear indication of the level of grip at the rear as I turn in, and therefore I can actually balance the car at the limit pretty well when initiating the turn. So to summarise, Assetto Corsa EVO's force feedback is good enough for me to be able to balance the car with a fair degree of precision on turning because of that strong self-aligning force that telegraphs what the rear is doing when I stamp on the brakes and trail brake into the corner. Moving on to the mid-corner phase, and this is where things start to completely unravel. At this point in the corner, I'm typically back on throttle and trying to keep the car in a neutral state so I can carry the highest apex speed possible. Therefore, the car balance is typically quite neutral. It could either understeer or oversteer at this point, depending on how much throttle that's been applied at the apex. At this point, what I really need to know is how much load the front tyres are under. The original Assetto Corsa communicates this beautifully, and I talk about this in depth in my first Assetto Corsa EVO review, so if you haven't seen that already, go and check it out, and specifically the part where I analyse Assetto Corsa's force feedback in depth. In Assetto Corsa EVO, the moment I get back on throttle, that initial step change increase in the force feedback which I can feel on turning is now gone, and as I play with the level of steering input at this point, there is essentially no change in the level of force coming through. What I discovered was if I overturn the wheel in an exaggerated fashion to induce understeer, there is a point where the force reduces, but it's so subtle and faint, and I would never be turning the wheel by this much during a corner anyway, so that makes it pretty redundant. Between the centre of the wheel and the point where I'm rotating it to, there is nothing but a squishy, springy sort of force that really doesn't change at all. Now in reality, when driving the Radical around long fast corners like Stowe Corner at Silverstone, and I'm really balancing the car on that edge, I'm of course getting nothing through the steering wheel, but what my body is detecting is a kind of relative change in lateral G-force, which allows me to keep the car pinned at the limit. In Assetto Corsa EVO, there is no change in force feedback to mirror this change in lateral G-force that I rely on in reality. Finally, we get to the final phase of the corner exit, and at this point I want to accelerate out the corner as cleanly as possible with throttle generally at or close to 100% applied. And the car will generally tend to understeer as the weight has shifted completely to the rear. However, any aggressive throttle behaviour will of course induce some power oversteer. This for me is where Assetto Corsa EVO's force feedback completely falls apart, and where my driving switches from being fairly natural and instinctive on turning to instead learning how much throttle to apply and almost preemptively correcting opposite lock based on visuals and frankly experience. For whatever reason, that strong self-aligning force that is really apparent when the front axle is loaded isn't anywhere near as powerful when the weight has been transferred back to the rear, and so it's really difficult to be precise with throttle application. When the self-aligning force does kick in, it's just way too late to be of any use, because at this point I'm losing momentum and correcting a sloppy slide. Therefore, it simply isn't possible to really balance the throttle effectively at the point when the car balance is neutral and I'm exiting the corner. I found myself constantly overcorrecting or undercorrecting, and knowing the amount of opposite lock to apply almost becomes guesswork. It is possible to correct slides, which as you can see from the footage I'm able to do, but these corrections are being made pretty much entirely off visuals and trying to keep the car pointing in the direction I want it to go. Because Assetto Corsa EVO's force feedback isn't communicating exactly when the rear is starting to break traction, it just isn't possible to drive the car with any kind of real intuition or precision. I'm just learning what feel like quite binary conditions. And this leads me to the next part, which is to discuss the problems with the physics. I believe that Assetto Corsa EVO has a fundamental problem with the tyre model. From my real world experience throwing my Radical about, I can say with absolute certainty that when driving a proper race car with slick tyres and downforce, there is a narrow but available window of slip which I'm clearly able to use to keep the car on the limits of available grip. Sometimes I overdo it, and a very quick application of opposite lock brings the car quickly back in line. I don't know if this applies to the road cars in Assetto Corsa EVO, but certainly with the race cars I've driven in the game, there appears to be a much wider slip curve, but that slip curve is also completely unusable. The moment the rear breaks traction, it seems to get stuck in the slide. So as a result, I'm then dialing back my throttle input to ensure that I don't induce any kind of slide when I'm mid-corner and exiting out of it. This is much less obvious when driving the slower race cars with traction control, like the BMW GT3. The traction control almost seems to mask this behaviour because it obviously limits how much the car steps out of line, and it's all happening quite slowly. If, however, you jump into something quick like the F2004, which has traction control as well, and you set the car up properly with a kind of neutral to oversteery balance to really try and carry as much speed through the corner as possible, the moment a slide occurs and the traction control kicks in, the car is in some kind of weird slide which completely kills any momentum. It just isn't possible to adjust the attitude of the slide quickly with steering and pedal inputs. Now, as a side note, here is some footage of Michael Schumacher driving the F2004 around, and you can clearly see from the onboard that there is a usable amount of slip. He is driving the car clearly at the limit with his amazing skills, but the fact is there is clearly a narrow window of slip which he's utilising to keep the car on that absolute edge through the corner. Jumping into the F2004 in the original Assetto Corsa, there is just an abundance of communication about every aspect of grip. There is so much change in the forces telling me exactly how much front grip there is, whether the rear is starting to break traction, and especially mid-corner, it is possible to be really ultra precise, balancing the car and keeping it in this very neutral state. Again, as mentioned, I cover this in depth in my previous video, but being able to now play the F2004 back to back in Assetto Corsa EVO and then in Assetto Corsa really makes the differences even more apparent. I will still be able to enjoy Assetto Corsa EVO because it certainly has enough of a depth to the physics and at least some force feedback communication, which at least at corner entry allows me to drive in a somewhat natural way. Unfortunately for Assetto Corsa EVO, the shadow of Assetto Corsa still looms large above it. Well, that's the end of the video. I hope you found it interesting, and I look forward to upcoming releases of Assetto Corsa EVO to see if things actually improve. Thank you for watching, and stay tuned because there will be plenty of videos from my real racing experiences coming next year. Until then, bye for now.